It's nothing. Now, she said, just me being silly about everything. She sighed. Since her misunderstanding with Snape, the twins' practical jokes, that awful business she'd read about in Tunks's report, having to travel by flu again, and now the problem in the bank, Cecilia reckoned the last day was not shaping up to be one of her best. I heard about the practical jokes. The twins are actually sorry, he said, smiling kindly at her. In fact, I've never seen Ron get annoyed with them about a prank before. Cecilia said nothing for a moment, trying to get her thoughts in order. Remus, did you know I needed a permit to be here? The smile on Remus's face gradually turned to horror and he leaned forward, one hand over his mouth. Oh no, he said. Cecilia, I'm so sorry, I forgot to mention to Dumbledore you were coming with us today. He looked at Cecilia, his eyes full of regret. Yes, I did know. Cecilia sighed, and smiled back. Not to worry, she said, tapping her handbag. I've got one now. I just hope Professor Dumbledore isn't too angry with me. Why should he be angry with you? Well, because I had to tell the goblin that I was working for him, she explained, trying not to let her mind dwell on the man who'd sat next to her. Dumbledore asked me not to say anything to anyone. Should she mention it to Remus? She'd have to mention the notebook though, which means she'd have to mention Snape. However could you think that was your fault? Remus shook his head. If anything, I should have stayed with you. If anyone's to blame, it's me. He leaned over and took his hand in hers. I agreed to make sure you were safe. Well, I am, said Cecilia brightly. No harm done, she added, and before she could stop herself said, could you give me a straight answer about my safety, Remus? I would be grateful for an honest answer. The easy expression that had reappeared on Remus's face went. Cecilia, began Remus, looking uncomfortable. I don't think I'm actually the right person to be talking to you about this. However, I do believe that you need to know what you're up against. Perhaps you could tell me what you already know? Do you know about Voldemort? He almost whispered the name. Yes, said Cecilia, thinking back to last night's conversation with Harry. I know about the wizards that follow him. I know what they do to moles. And I know that the Order of the Phoenix had been set up before when Voldemort was powerful before. The last bit she'd pieced together from the many conversations that had taken place last night. Then there's actually very little I need to tell you, said Remus. The Death Eaters are members of very respectable wizard families. If ever they should find out that you are a mole, not only could that jeopardize the Order, but your life would be in extreme danger. He swallowed and shifted in his chair. Their beliefs are appealing to ordinary wizards because of the promise of job promotions and riches. There are some Death Eaters whose beliefs are so extreme they go out hunting for pleasure. Cecilia shuddered, recalling the trip she had made several years ago to the Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum. All you needed to do was change the name Voldemort to Adolf Hitler. She realized Remus was touching her hand again. That's what the Order is fighting, said Remus. Were it not for a few unlucky moves the last time, Voldemort would have been killed 16 years ago. This time, we will succeed. We have moles on our side now, Cecilia. We have you, with skills and wisdom that he has no understanding of. That gives us head start. Watcher, came a voice nearby. I wondered where you lot had got to. Remus, I thought you were coming back to M&S? Remus looked up at Tunks, about to admit he'd forgotten, but Cecilia cut in. Sorry, she said. It was my fault. I got all flustered at the bank, and the goblins frightened me. Remus was kind enough to wait until I was ready. Cecilia looked at Remus, who smiled gratefully back. Did you buy anything? Tunks shook her head. No, but I saw some great things that would look fab on you, she said. Turquoise dress robes, gorgeous cloaks, broom guards, the works. Well, I don't think I'll need robes anytime soon, laughed Cecilia. When would I wear them? I mean, am I even allowed to wear them? Course, said Tunks, pulling up a stool. Why wouldn't you be? They're not just for wizards, and besides when you become, but Cecilia did not get to find out what she might become, because Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and the children had seen me and were approaching. Chaps, I've ordered lunch, said Mr. Weasley. Plowman's lunch is all round. Is that okay? Mrs. Weasley looked at him. The Ministry tab. They owe me some expenses, he explained. Over lunch, the Ron and Harry showed Cecilia what they'd bought, an odd collection of bits and pieces, quills, ink, something for waxing on a broom handle and some things that Cecilia could not begin to make out their function to be. Hermione, having picked up on Cecilia's confusion, began to explain what they all were, much to the amusement of Harry and Ron. Hey, that's not mine, said Ron, a few moments later. He grabbed a packet out of Hermione's hand. He was about to throw it in the direction of the twins, but Mrs. Weasley caught Ron's hand in mid-projectile. Boom boom bath bombs, she said, reading the label of the packet aloud slowly to Fred and George, giving them a look which would most definitely have frightened even Snape. They said nothing, hanging their heads slightly. Mrs. Weasley handed the bath bombs to Mr. Weasley, giving him an "I've had it. Now it's your turn" look. "Did you buy that book in the end?" asked Hermione, changing the subject. Cecilia shook her head, swallowing some hard-boiled egg. "But I'm going back for it now. I've got some wizard money," she said, pausing from her lunch and reached for the pouch of wizard money. "Which reminds me, can you tell me about these coins?" she asked the children, pulling out one of each from the pouch. "That one's a galleon," said Hermione, "and the silver one is a sickle. That bronze one is a canute." "A nut," said Cecilia, thinking it didn't resemble any type of nut she'd ever seen before. Hermione sighed, and patiently talked Cecilia through the denominations. After lunch, she headed back with Tunks to M&S. Her brain was now addled with thought of how many nuts were in a galleon and was surprised when Tunks entered a small shop 5 minutes' walk away from the Leaky Cauldron. The sign on the door read, "Deirdre Imunus, clothing for the discerning witch." Underneath, in smaller letters, it read, "No job too big or small, alterations of size and color while you wait." Oh, thought Cecilia, not M&S. Imunus. How silly of me, she thought. She followed Tunks in, through a small reception area into a huge shop floor. It was lit from above and beautiful white light shimmered down, bathing the many rails of clothes in opulent light. Cecilia glanced at the rails. Some clothes looked like ones she would definitely have found in mall shops, dresses, trousers, tops, you name it, in a wide range of styles. She was about to pull out some smart-looking black trousers when Tunks called her over. "This is what I was talking about," she said, holding up a set of robes. They were beautiful. The fabric was made as if the threads were continuous, and matching buttons lined the front edge. A small curved pattern outlined the collar and around the wide sleeves, and it was lined with much finer fabric. Cecilia touched it, feeling the material glide over her skin. "Great, isn't it?" said Tunks. "I bet this would really suit you." She held open the sleeves of the gown for Cecilia to slip on. "But it's a wizard's robe, though," Cecilia, looking uncertain. "I can't wear that." "Come on," said Tunks, impatiently. "If you don't like the turquoise, we can change it anything you like." "Okay," thought Cecilia, "here goes nothing." She stuck one arm in, and then another, the oversized fabric drowning her. Suddenly the material changed, and the robe began to feel fitted across her back. "Take a look," said Tunks, pointing to a mirror. When she looked, Cecilia gasped. She looked stunning. The material fitted perfectly, and didn't cling to her hips, but skimmed her waist and fell to shoe height. Told you you'd like it, said Tonks, as Cecilia beamed at her. Turquoise is so you. But what about yellow? She pulled her wand out of her jacket, and waved it past Cecilia's arm. No, said Cecilia, as the canary-colored hue filtered through the robe. I don't think it's me. Just then, the shopkeeper approached them. Can I help you ladies? We have a special offer this week, complimentary frock with any dress robe. Thanks Madam Imanus, said Tonks, smiling at the witch. Don't know how long we'll be here yet. You always have such a fantastic range to choose from. Madam Imanus smiled. Nymphadora, you know you can take as much time as you please, she said. Cecilia noticed Tonks' cringe and she suppressed a giggle. I'll be out here if you need me. Nymphadora? Asked Cecilia, innocently. I came to the conclusion long ago that Mum must have been on the homebrew when she came up with that one, Tonks conceded, and turned back to Cecilia. So, not yellow then? What about fuchsia? Cecilia and Tonks spent the afternoon going through practically everything Madame Imanus had to offer. They tried on dresses, skirts and tops, jumpers and shoes. Cecilia had wondered where the changing rooms were and was amazed when Tonks had flicked her wand, and Cecilia gasped as she saw herself wearing the dress she just had folded over her arm. Tonks had chosen some jeans, plain jerseys, a new work robe for work, and a rocker-type t-shirt, making Cecilia promise not to tell Remus she had it. He doesn't think it's feminine wearing this kind of thing, she whispered, conspiratorially. Better buy two, then whispered back Cecilia, and both of them burst out into fits of giggles. It was only when Madame Imanus came to inform them that she would be closing in a quarter of an hour did they hurriedly collect together everything they wanted to buy. Cecilia wondered where the time had gone, and had a vague feeling that despite the morning's events she'd actually enjoyed herself. Are you going to have the dress robe? Asked Tonks, as they headed to the reception. I'm still not sure, said Cecilia, slipping on the robe she'd tried on first again. It wasn't because she didn't like it. The robe was gorgeous, she thought, as she looked at her reflection. But she wondered whether it would be appropriate. What if they thought she was taking the mick, mocking their way of life? I would much prefer it in black, said Cecilia. If Tonks ended up persuading her, she might as well at least have it in the color that suited her best. And besides, she didn't have to wear it, she could just keep it out of the way. Black? Asked Tonks, uncertainly. Are you sure? Not a bright color? Cecilia shook her head. Tonks flicked her wand and the robe darkened. Wow! I could actually believe I don't need to lose a couple of stone, thought Cecilia to herself. Happy with that? Asked Madame Imanus. If you are going for that robe, please let me show you the matching frocks. Cecilia chose a long dress made of the same fabric as the robe and, as she picked it up, the frock's color flooded from turquoise to black. Marveling at such a versatile shop, she followed Tonks and they paid for the clothes. Cecilia felt happy. She'd never found shopping for clothes that exhilarating, and to be honest she hadn't been looking forward to it. But she just had one of the most enjoyable afternoons of recent months and realized that, with at least one aspect of wizard life, she was fitting in. 88,888,888. They arrived back at Grimwald Place an hour later. Cecilia had asked Tonks if they could return to Flourish and Blots so she could buy magic and moles, and they had popped into Bouts, the potion shop. Tonks had bought a tonic for her skin and Cecilia had been astounded for about the 80th time that day at what a shop on Diagonally had to offer, and picked up an owl order catalogue, intending to look for anything that might help towards her research. She'd barely thought about work all day, but now the shopping trip was over. The thought of returning to Hogwarts and, more to the point, working with Snape, was beginning to prey on her mind. Time to go, Tonks had said, as she pushed the potion into her inside pocket and they headed back down Diagonally. Can't wait to see what the others have bought. I remember how much fun it was shopping for school with Mum, she'd said wistfully. They passed the shop with the brooms, and Cecilia had stopped, looking at the team shirts advertised in the window. Quidditch, said Tunks. The best game out there. Nothing beats a good game of footy, Cecilia had whispered, half to herself. Tim liked football. Cecilia loved seeing him off with his best friend on Saturdays, pretending that she cared little for the game. She'd busy herself with something wifely, like making a cake or doing the ironing, but with the radio on, listening out for the score, knowing that her Tim was watching it. We can go to a game, if you like, Tunks had said, continuing to walk back down diagonally. Having said that though, since the embarrassment that was the World Cup, I'm not sure you'd want to. They have Quidditch at Hogwarts though. Here we are, she said, as they reached the leaky cauldron again. The journey back if anything had been worse than the previous morning, and Cecilia had dropped her shopping near the fireplace when they arrived, dashing upstairs to the bathroom. Though she hadn't been sick, she did feel very ill, and made a note to herself to find out about other wizardly modes of transport. When she went back downstairs, she noticed that the kitchen and living room was busy with about 20 or so people. She recognized a few of them. Charlie Weasley was sitting talking to Fred and George, Remus was chatting to another wizard over by the fireplace, Benjamin Wurgs was pointing things out to Tunks at the kitchen table. Tunks looked up momentarily and then walked over to Cecilia. Feeling better? I put your shopping in your room. Who is everyone? Asked Cecilia, gazing round at the faces. The Order, said Tunks. There's a meeting tonight. Before Cecilia could reply, Mrs. Weasley interrupted them. Cecilia, how are you, dear? Before Cecilia could reply, she continued. Professor Dumbledore is here. He would like to speak to you. Cecilia nodded, smiling at Tunks, and followed Mrs. Weasley through a door which opened for them as they approached in the oak panelling. She gestured towards Dumbledore, and left. The room was furnished in much the same as the one where she had met Dumbledore the first time she'd got to Grimmauld Place, old man's study effect, despite the room being in a different place in the house. Not much the same, thought Cecilia, noticing the flowers on the coffee table. It was the same, and the effect gave her the impression the room had been folded away until it was needed again. Ah, Cecilia, said Dumbledore, rising from a winged-back chair. Did you have a successful shopping expedition? Yes, Professor, she said. I am sorry for not informing you I was going, and for any inconvenience with the bank. She breathed, hoping it was the right thing to say. Not at all. No inconvenience, he said, waving his hand downwards as he began to pace. I asked Remus and Severus to inform me when you were likely to need a permit. Remus apologizes for his oversight, he added. However, I must ask Cecilia, do you have anything you wish to tell me? Cecilia paused. She hadn't actually been expecting that, and was at a loss as to what to say, and images of her conversation with the blonde-haired man crept into her mind. When she didn't reply, Dumbledore gestured towards the sofa for her to sit, and sat back down himself on the wing-backed chair. Professor Snape told me about yesterday afternoon. He regrets his actions, Cecilia. He wishes you to know he lost his temper, something which he understands cannot happen again if you are to work together in the future. You're asking me whether I will return to the research? Asked Cecilia. I know he's sorry, but he doesn't seem to realize that I know. As far as I'm concerned, it never happened. And yet, prompted Dumbledore. I have to admit, returning here was a convenient reason to leave yesterday. However, you must understand, Professor, I would have wanted a break anyway. Of course, said Dumbledore gently. I could hardly expect you to remain in Hogwarts for the entire duration of your research. Professor, began Cecilia. She wanted to ask him about what she had found on the parchment last night, and why Snape had acted in the way he had. Dumbledore held up his hand. "It is not my place to discuss the reason why Severus lost his temper. That is his privilege, should he so choose." "It's like he's reading my mind," thought Cecilia, and swallowed. "I always intended to return," said Cecilia. "I mean that now, as much as last night. However, I still don't think I am going to get entirely to the bottom of this research unless I know fully what is involved. I don't care how disturbing it might be, or how much danger I could be in. I made a commitment, and I believe what I'm doing is important." Dumbledore looked at her over the top of his half-moon spectacles and rose, pacing the carpet again. "You are indeed right," he said. "You cannot be expected to make such a commitment unless you know what is going on around you." He paused and looked at Cecilia. "It is for this reason that I wish you to become a member of Order of the Phoenix. The position will be honorary, but this aside, you have entirely the same status as every other member, and you will be entitled to know what they know." Cecilia stared back at Dumbledore, thinking guiltily about a person she had met at the bank. "Professor," she began. "I am grateful of your trust in me," she said, and pressed on, refusing to allow her mind to think, lest it stopped her. "You asked me earlier whether I had something you wished me to tell you." She swallowed and continued. "Today in the bank, a wizard sat next to me. I'd put down some of the things out of my handbag on the chair next to me, one of those being a book Professor Snape gave to me to communicate with him. A wizard picked it up, and asked which professor I was working with at Hogwarts. I said I couldn't remember his name. There, it was off her chest. Whatever happened next, at least her conscience was clear." Silence reigned for a few moments, until Dumbledore approached her again. Cecilia stood up. "I am truly grateful for you telling me that, Cecilia," he said, patting her lightly on the back. Just then, there was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Weasley entered. "Everyone's here, Professor," she said, looking slightly flustered. "And I mean everyone. We're so full in the kitchen, Bathsheba and Charlie are having to hover at the back." "Very well, Molly," he said, and turned to Cecilia. "Cecilia, please allow me to escort you to your first meeting of the Order of the Phoenix." 88,888,888. As soon as she entered the kitchen, she realized Mrs. Weasley was right. The place was packed, filled with murmurs and an undercurrent of noise as everyone was speaking to each other at once. Mrs. Weasley was right, there was nowhere left to sit, so she stood near the corner by the door, out of the way. She surveyed the faces. There were people she'd met before, Remus and Tonks sitting next to Mr. Weasley, Bathsheba, Daedalus and Benjamin, Moody, who'd appeared at her house with Snape after the break-in, and near the back by the cooker, Bill Weasley and another witch, were engaged in what looked like a lively conversation. She scanned round the room, thinking about all of the people here. They were fighting for what they believed in too. Even if Cecilia wasn't like them, she had seen what this dark magic could do and it had repulsed her. Then, her train of thought was derailed as her gaze landed on a face. Not exactly handsome, but certainly if he were younger, Cecilia thought, considering his strong features, quite attractive. There was something about him, a presence, an air. Just then, this wizard caught her gaze. His dark eyes locked with hers for what seemed to Cecilia like eons. They projected wild excitement, with a hint of danger, as if he would, given the chance, throw caution to the wind for the fun of it. But there was also a feeling of inner sorrow, reflected back from the incaution, and Cecilia wondered vaguely to its cause. With a deal of effort, realizing how silly she must look, she broke the connection and looked back at Dumbledore, who was now standing up waiting to address them. "Wizards and witches of the Order, may I have your attention, please? We have a lot to get through tonight, and time is pressing. May I begin with apologies? Minerva cannot make it this evening. She has some pressing work to do for the Scottish Witches Institute. Mr. Weasley, if you would kindly ensure she gets a copy of the minutes, he said, looking up. Mr. Weasley nodded, and continued to write. Also, Severus Snape, who is otherwise engaged on order business. There were one or two sniggers from various parts of the room, which were hurriedly stifled as Dumbledore looked round. Now, I would like to start with the shift pattern for the errors. The guard rotor I have here, please circulate it. If there are any problems you wish to raise with me, please do so. Alastor informs me that main areas of concern have been amicably agreed, which means you each have one more shift than last month. Moody nodded and stood up. Thank you, he said, his eye roaming the room independently. We have organized that some squibs, loyal to us that they are, he added nodding towards Dumbledore, to work in the Marylebone area. Extra vigilance. He shouted, looking fiercely round the room. Should there be a repeat of the Mole attacks last night, we are sure to catch the perpetrators. He continued to look round the kitchen. Cecilia shivered, and folded her arms over her chest, thinking about the moving images she'd seen last night. Another wizard stood up. I have the report from Azkaban this month. The wizards suspected of being Death Eaters have not revealed anything under interrogation. I have been trying to get myself to every interview, and I managed to get hold of security images, but nothing had been said. Thank you, Sturgis, said Dumbledore, but Sturgis remained on his feet. You have something else to add? Sturgis nodded. Yes, we have a witness in London, a squib from a highly respected family, who came to the Ministry of Magic last week. He was interviewed by Fudge, but apparently Fudge didn't believe anything he said. I was fortunate to still be at work when he arrived, it being about 9 p.m., and I walked back towards the Mole Underground with him. He was rather annoyed at Fudge and he described two wizards to me who he suspected of leaving a Mole residence. The descriptions he gave match those of McNair and Wilberforce, who as we all know have long been considered followers of you-know-who. Whereabouts did the man say he'd seen these men? Asked Benjamin, interrupting quickly. Hackney, replied Sturgis, Queen's Parade. It was reported in the Mole papers this week that an old woman was murdered in flats in Hackney, said Benjamin. The newspaper said the Mole police had a difficult case on their hands because there were no marks on her body and were at a loss to know how she died. Thank you, Benjamin. Perhaps you and Sturgis could visit the squib and follow this up between you? Asked Dumbledore. The two wizards nodded at one another. Cecilia, who had been listening intently to the proceedings, now noticed that one or two wizards were looking between her and Dumbledore. Following Sturgis's information, another wizard discussed the possibility of you-know-who or Death Eaters targeting Mole politicians at a conference that was to begin in September. Another wizard wondered whether he knew of such things and cover was extended to the event. Dumbledore then went on to discuss Harry Potter. At the mention of his name, Cecilia's ears pricked up and gave her full attention to what Dumbledore was saying. He told the Order that Harry would be returning again to Hogwarts, and that his security was the utmost importance following the return of Voldemort. He praised Harry's skill in overcoming Voldemort at the Triwizard Championship, and Cecilia wondered what he could mean. Yes, Doris? Said Dumbledore as an elderly witch raised her hand. She stood up. How can we be assured that Harry will continue to be safe at Hogwarts? We know he had to use magic again this summer, and he got into trouble with the Ministry. That was when he was with the Moles, said another wizard, nearer the front. You know, I really don't understand why you don't just allow him to stay here with Sirius, he said. Cecilia turned in the direction the wizard was motioning and noticed the dark-eyed man fold his arms, and rest his head on his chin. Sebastian, I must ask you to trust my judgment when I say, to all here, Dumbledore looked round the kitchen, taking in the Order members, that until he is of age, Harry must remain with his aunt and uncle when he is not at Hogwarts. "But they're moles!" exclaimed Doris over the low hubbub that had begun. At her words, it began to die down and Cecilia realized that everyone was looking at her. Dumbledore gave her a small smile. "Perhaps now is a good opportunity to introduce Mrs. Cecilia Frobisher, who, I am sure you recall from our last meeting, I have recruited to assist Severus." Everyone was looking at her now, and she noticed an element of uncertainty express itself in the eyes of some of the wizards. Their progress is significant and it is vital. It is for this reason that I wish to propose Mrs. Frobisher as a member of the Order of the Phoenix. The room went quiet momentarily, then suddenly erupted. Everyone began to speak at once, some were shouting at one another, with furious gestures towards Cecilia. A voice from the back of the room declared with fervor that if a mole became a member of the Order, he would quit then and there. Another wizard actually got to his feet and looked as if he was about to challenge Dumbledore to his face. Cecilia looked around. If she had known that it would cause this much hostility, she would never have suggested needing more information. Dumbledore attempted to call order. He boomed over the noise, which subsided a little, trying to gain their attention. Much of the volume died away, but there was still an undercurrent of unrest. "If our strategy is to work, Mrs. Frobisher must be privy to the information we possess. I wish to propose her as a member," he repeated. "However, I cannot make you accept my proposition." The noise began to grow again, and the wizard who had almost spoken out to Dumbledore shouted, "She's got no idea. It won't be her risking her neck like we all have. She couldn't possibly comprehend what we're all up against. How could these people possibly say she didn't understand? Okay, she didn't know who this Voldemort was, and wasn't personally connected to this in the way that they were. But she had been sickened to her stomach when she read Tunks's report. The people he and his followers were killing Wurmels. There were people, actual people here, her fellow countrymen. Of course she cared. Before she realized she had done it, Cecilia had moved over to near where Dumbledore was standing, and began to speak loudly, trying to combat the noise. Dumbledore stood back for her and allowed her to take his place. "I do," she was saying, "I do understand." The room fell quiet when they realized she was speaking. She faltered, when she realized she had their attention. Actually when I came, I didn't understand." "You are quite right there," she said, gesturing to a wizard to her left who had pointed that put moments before. "I didn't understand fully what I was taking on when Professor Dumbledore took me on. I took the job to begin with because I was initially intrigued about magic and wizards. I wondered what on earth you would want that I had the skills for." She looked round the room, catching everyone's eye in turn. She noticed Remus smile, and she felt a bit more relaxed. "But I have seen the effects of this dark magic which you are all fighting so very hard to defeat." Cecilia inhaled, banded on her feelings which she was now sharing with virtual strangers. "Those people you call moles, the non-magical population of this country, people like me, they are suffering, dying because of these dark wizards. It very much does involve me if the next person attacked is my sister, or my mum or my hus." She caught herself, and swallowed. "Other people I know and care about," she said. "I feel privileged to be in a position where I can do something about this. A lot of moles cannot. Regardless of whether you wish me to be a member of the Order, I will continue with this work as long as Professor Dumbledore needs me, and as long as what I can sacrifice of myself goes in any way to fight this." She stopped, and smiled a little, indicating she was finished. The kitchen was now silent, and, just as Cecilia wondered what would happen next, a solitary sound started. It was Remus. He was applauding. Then Tunks joined in. Next the Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. A few wizards on the front looked steadfast, but nearly half of the wizards there were clapping now. Cecilia looked round at Dumbledore who was smiling warmly at her, and she stood back from the table. She felt happier now, Some of the wizards supported her, and even if none of them had, she had meant what she said. She would continue the work as long as she was needed. Dumbledore stood up. Now, as I was saying, I cannot force you to accept Mrs. Frobisher as a member of the Order. He placed a piece of parchment on the table. However, my proposition stands. It is your duty now to vote. Please raise your hand if you accept Mrs. Frobisher into the Order of the Phoenix. A number of hands were raised. Though many of them were slow in doing so, some of the members were still looking at each other questioningly. 11, said Dumbledore, counting the hands. He gestured towards the parchment on the table. And I have here the decisions of Minerva and Severus. They also accept you as a member, he said, addressing Cecilia. Now, please raise your hands if you do not accept Mrs. Frobisher as a member. 13. He said, nodding slightly. A tie. Cecilia wondered what that meant now. Dumbledore looked at Sirius, who had kept his arms resolutely folded since Cecilia had got up to speak. His mouth was set firm, as if forcing himself not to say anything. Sirius, I notice that you did not vote either way. Do you need longer to make up your mind? Dumbledore looked at him, and Sirius looked between Dumbledore and Cecilia. She noticed that the room was again silent. No, said Sirius slowly, I don't need any more time. His voice was edgy as if, to Cecilia, a little nervous. Please can we hear your vote? More silence reigned, and the wizards of the Order looked between Sirius and Cecilia. He raised his hand. Is that for my proposal, Sirius? Asked Dumbledore, and despite herself, Cecilia held her breath. Yes, he said. Cecilia exhaled, and smiled. Dumbledore surveyed the Order again and beamed. In that case, could you all welcome Cecilia Frobisher as our newest member of the Order of the Phoenix? The kitchen is filled with applause again, and Cecilia smiled. She caught Sirius's glance and he was smiling too, his eyes twinkling. When the meeting was over, Remus hurried over to congratulate her, shaking her firmly by the hand. That speech of yours, he said, smiling, it really touched me. In the head, probably, laughed Tonks. Just kidding, Cecilia, she added. Come on, she said, pulling Remus away into the living room. Mrs. Weasley hurried over, beaming. Congratulations, she began, and stopped, unsure of what to say. Thanks, she said, but it's not really a celebration. I meant what I said, so I'm sure I've got my work cut out now, to live up to those promises I made. Mrs. Weasley smiled, and tapped her shoulder. We have every confidence in you, she said, turning to Mr. Weasley as she spoke, indicating she included him in her comment. I know you'll succeed in this. They turned and left the kitchen, and Cecilia proceeded upstairs, intending to go to bed. As she climbed the stairs, she jumped, hearing the sounds of disapparating wizards in the living room. Cecilia turned to enter her room, but paused, wondering whether she had been pranked again. She carefully opened the door, peering inside. She couldn't see anything unusual about the room as she switched on the light, but just to be safe she pulled her still-packed shopping bags and propped them against the door. 10 minutes later, having had a shower and feeling quite ready for bed now, she closed the door behind her, giving it a quick pull just after she shut it, just in case, and turned, walking back to the bed. The Order, she thought, considering the evening. So now I am able to know what they know. Is that a good thing, she wondered. Considering the last couple of days, she wasn't entirely sure. Just then her eye caught the large paper bag which contained the Magic and Moles book she had bought from Flourish and Blots. She crossed the room and removed it from the bag, idly flicking to page 127. Her eye came across a paragraph titled, Are Wizards Born or Made? She looked up from the book, as she sat on the edge of the bed. A very interesting question, she thought. Were they made? It could be argued so, if you consider they go to school to learn magic, and that they have to practice to become better. An easy answer then. Were they born? She put down the book next to her, the pages she'd been looking at still open, and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Hermione said her parents were muggles, but she was a witch. Tonks. She sat back up again, and looked down at the page again. Tonks's father was a mole, and her mother a witch. So witches and wizards can be born, even if one of their parents is non-magical, she concluded. She ran that sentence through her mind, and an image of a chart, interlinking the witches with their respective families formed. Cecilia got up quickly and dashed to her handbag for a pencil and paper. Paper, she thought, eventually tipping the contents out onto the floor. When she couldn't find any, she tore the 18th August page out of her diary. At least it would be useful for something, she thought, sitting back down on the bed. She drew Hermione's image, using a dotted line from Hermione's parents to her, and using a solid line down to Hermione. Another she drew connecting Tonks with her father with a similar line, and a solid line with her mother. Cecilia glanced back at the open book again, then back at her diagrams, and a thought struck her. If I'm not very much mistaken, she said aloud, this looks suspiciously like they're magical because of something they inherit, or not from their parents. Her voice trailed off and she got to her feet. Hermione's parents are non-magical, she said aloud, yet she is a witch. And Tonks is a witch, and one of her parents is non-magical. Cecilia crossed back to the bed, and underneath the diagrams she drew 2 4x4 boxes, marking in letters for genetic combinations. When she was happy with what she'd written, she turned the book to the index, and looked down for genetics. There was no entry. Quickly, she tried inheritance. Nothing. Leafing through the pages quickly, she looked for birth, and turned to the page number given. Cecilia scanned the page, looking for any clue that she may be right, but the details were sketchy, just giving indications of pure-blood wizards, and the same narrative of half-blood and mole-born wizards. Damn, she said to herself. But it seemed so likely. She folded the pages of magic and moles closed, with the diagram she had drawn sandwiched between the pages. It has to be to do with what the children inherit from their parents. It must do. Moles inherit genes and DNA, so wizard children with mole parents must inherit at least something from their parents. Just then, the Slytherin exercise book caught her eye. It was lying near her bag. By the rest of the contents she had tipped out of it. Of course. Severus would know. She grabbed the book and, turning to the first page, wrote, I suspect there may be a genetic link connecting non-magic and wizard people, she wrote. She rubbed the end of the quill across her bottom lip absently. What else should I say? Perhaps I should say I am ready to begin work again, she thought, but a voice in her head replied, but you're not. It's vital that I discuss this with you at a time most convenient to you. Cecilia. There. At least now he will know I wish to work with him again, and at least this might be a solid start. Feeling exhilarated, she put down magic and moles on the chair in her room, and pulled out Mysterious Mythology. Tomorrow, she told herself. I'll read them tomorrow with a clear head. She pulled on a nightgown and turned off the light, getting into bed and snuggling down. As the coolness of the covers met her warm legs, she idly hoped that it hadn't been bugged, metaphorically or actually. After about half an hour, Cecilia sat back up in the dark. Her mind was racing, urging her to get up and read through the books again, and she knew she wouldn't get any sleep if she ignored it. Well, let's at least get Mysterious Mythology finished tonight, she thought, as she redressed. And I'm feeling hungry too, she thought, and realized she hadn't actually had anything since lunch in the leaky cauldron. Quietly she exited her room, carrying the book, her diary and a pen down with her. She glanced around the living room as she got to the bottom of the stairs, but it was empty, everyone having presumably either left or gone to bed. She flicked on the main light, and proceeded to the kitchen, switching on that light too. Dumping the things she was carrying on the table, she randomly opened cupboards in search of something to eat, and glanced round for the kettle. When she had found neither any food nor the kettle, she sat down, cursing herself again for not remembering that she was in the company of wizards, who did catering their way. Never mind, she thought, pulling herself up a chair, nibbling the knuckle on her index finder absently. She opened to page 37 and began to read the story there, about a baker in London who tried to make the best buns in town. He found that the finer the flour he used, the best buns and bread he could make. So he made the flour so fine, he was happy to bake buns for the king, so he left the oven on overnight, but a spark caused the finely sieved flour to catch on fire. Why did that sound familiar, thought Cecilia, and yawned, turning over a page. Half an hour later, Cecilia was a third of the way down a page when she was interrupted. She looked up to see a man standing in the doorway smiling at her, a rich, dark smile. It was Sirius. "So," he said, approaching her. "A member of the order," said a voice, rich and smooth as honey. "You're the first male ever to be granted such high an honor." He smiled, and Cecilia found, despite herself, being drawn into his dark gaze, and unconsciously closed mysterious mythology. Closer to, he seemed slightly younger, his eyes seemed brighter with a hint of merriment. But not entirely. Cecilia thought she could see storm clouds brooding deeper within. She opened her mouth to say something but stopped, as he closed the kitchen door behind him. "Sirius," he said, "welcome to my home. If you could call it that," he added grimly, glancing round the kitchen. Cecilia thought back to her first morning. So, this was the mysterious wizard, owner of Grimmauld Place, Harry's godfather. She thought back to her first morning. So he was the one who Remus had been chasing after on her first morning there. He extended his hand. "Pleased to meet you, at last." She took it. His grip was quite tight, and her fingers felt a bit numb afterwards. "I knew a mole once," he continued, pulling up a chair beside her. "Sweet young thing," he mused, then looked back at Cecilia. "It must be such a burden for you bear all this information," he said, glancing down at the closed book. Cecilia glanced at him, and a small shiver went through her. "I really must be getting to bed," she said uncertainly. "Why?" a voice asked her, in her mind. "You'd much rather stay here and talk to Sirius." "You're welcome here as long as you please," he said, "as you're a member of the order, and as this is our headquarters." Cecilia sat back down on the chair. "Okay," she said back to her mind, "you win." "Ah," he said, glancing down at Mysterious Mythology, Remus's old book. He sneaked it to Hogwarts once, but his mum sent a howler to him, and made him hand it over to Dumbledore. "Can I get you anything? A drink perhaps?" "Tea would be lovely," said Cecilia, smiling. "The research really will have to wait till tomorrow then," she thought. Sirius removed his wand from his back pocket and, with a swish, 2 cups and a pot of tea stood on the kitchen table. He quickly poured the tea, adding the milk. Cecilia hated milk in her tea, but said nothing. "So, whereabouts do you live, Cecilia? Is it nice?" "Better than here," she said, smiling over her cup. Sirius snorted. "Anywhere's better than here. Grimsby Docks would be better than here," he said. "You're married, then?" he added, glancing at Cecilia's right hand. "Not anymore," she said, "my husband died a few months ago." "Yourself?" she added, determined to direct the focus of the conversation off her. "No," he said, "never found the right girl. But 13 years in prison for something I didn't do doesn't really help," he said bitterly, and then brightened. "Tea okay?" She looked down at her cup and took a sip. Ugh. She hadn't had tea with milk in since she was 16, and the taste was quite horrible. "So," he continued, "you're working with Snape then? How's that all going? All right actually. He takes a bit of getting used to, though. Ha! said Sirius, moving his chair a bit closer to her. I'd have thought it would take a geological age to get used to old Snivellus, he said. Snivellus? Yes, just his school nickname only his best friends were allowed to call him by. A smirk passed over his lips. Was that sarcasm? Severus isn't that bad, actually, said Cecilia. Only 10 minutes ago she was feeling fine, but now, tiredness was creeping up on her. You're not serious. And here I was thinking you were a sensible mole, Cecilia. You don't get on, then? She asked innocently. An expression crossed Sirius's face as if Cecilia had just made the understatement of the century. Not really, he replied. Difference of opinion. He paused, and repositioned himself, so he was looking directly at Cecilia. You're getting on well then, working together. Bet it must be strange for you to find out about wizards, and magic. You don't say. She laughed, and turned to face him. But then stranger things have happened to me. Really? Said Sirius, with an incredulous smile. No. Said Cecilia, giggling now. What on earth had come over her? So do you know what you're looking for? What's the research about? Cecilia blinked, her head seemed a bit light. She paused, swallowing. What do I say? She promised Snape she wouldn't say anything to anyone. What is it you're doing with Snape? Tell me. Promise it won't go any further. He coaxed, leaning towards her. Cecilia began to speak irrespective of what her brain was trying urgently to tell her. Professor Dumbledore said we are looking for the connection between moles and wizards. Remus gave me his book, she gestured vaguely in the direction of mysterious mythology, and I think it's got a generic connection. Bloody hell, she thought to herself, what happened there? For some reason, despite her best intentions, when this man asked her, she was compelled to answer. Cecilia couldn't think straight, and she stood up, trying to breathe a bit slower. Maybe she needed a sleep. How are you two getting on then? Cecilia thought back to the evening, on her second day when Remus gave her mysterious mythology. He's a lovely man, she said, her voice trailing off, ignoring the embarrassment that her mind was telling her she should feel about their encounter. Snivellus, said Sirius in disbelief. Oh, Severus? Giggled Cecilia. What was the matter with her? She couldn't control what she was saying. Great, she began, as her mind switched to the events of the previous evening but? She sighed, trying to concentrate. No, she told herself. Stop. Yesterday, said Cecilia, her mind running over the events of yesterday afternoon in the dungeon. She rubbed her left wrist absently. What happened? What did he do? Cecilia didn't want to answer. She tried not to let the words escape her mouth. She'd promised not to say anything, so why was she? It was like a dream. Sirius was asking these questions. I'd found something in a book and he got angry when he found out I'd read it. He grabbed it off me. She looked down. The work then, is there anything else to it? Sirius got up to join her, standing close, as if they were sharing one big secret. He tilted her head so she was looking into his deep dark eyes. Again Cecilia spoke despite trying not to. Severus told me something about a young wizard, a boy who'd lost his parents when he was a baby. She looked up questioningly at Sirius. He was close to her now, his hips leaning next to hers, his body curling round her. She wanted more than anything to push past him to run away. No, said Sirius, almost a whisper. He cleared his throat and drew back slightly from her. It sounds intriguing. What do you need his boy for? Not entirely sure, but it's something to do with his powers. He suddenly stood tall, towering over her. What about his powers? He demanded. We've got to investigate their nature. Study them. What was going on? She wanted to remain silent, to leave, but she was rooted to the spot and something was making her speak when she was asked a question, to answer it truthfully, like it was overriding her mind. She had to get out of there. Why? What are you going to do with him? He gripped the top of her arms, and she could feel the power in his hands. I don't know. But you have a plan, you and Snivellus. He spat the words at her. Cecilia tried to push past him. She was feeling very sick. She couldn't get a clear focus in her mind's eye was fuzzy, and she felt confused and tired. Please, she said, but he blocked her way. What are you going to do to him? Powers, stammered Cecilia, dropping her head. He grabbed her chin and forced her to look at him. What about them? His voice was icy, but she tried to keep control, fighting herself. When she didn't answer, he yelled, Tell me, you little fool. Cecilia felt sick, and her skin was clammy and cold and her mind was addled, as if she had a bad head cold. Go. She thought to herself muzzily. Take them away, she stuttered eventually, exhausted at the effort she had put into restraining her speech. What? Screamed Sirius. He caught her by the waist as she tried to push past him, and they ended up on the floor. She tried to scream, but all that came out was a huff as Sirius landed on top of her, winding her. There was a crash as the table went over, sending the china and half-drunk tea all over the kitchen. She struggled to stop him, but he sat astride her, pinning her down and held both of her hands away, clamped down by one of his own. He held his wand to her chest. She could feel his breath on her neck, tinged with whiskey. You're not leaving until I say. How are you going to do this? By what method are you going to take away his powers? He shuffled round trying to hold her down as she struggled. Try me, he said, threateningly. Please, she tried, but he'd put down his wand and was holding her down by the arms. Do you really think I'm going to let you go near him? I should never have let you leave today with the others. He's had enough to cope with to last him a lifetime. What would you know about sacrifice? I've had just about enough of it, he shouted at her, shaking her arms. The sooner I get rid of you, you stupid idiotic mole, the better it will be for everyone. Keep still. I'm going to put an end to this now. He hissed in a voice tinged with triumph and, picking up his wand, he held it flat again against her chest. Snivellus will not be able to do this work alone, he continued, addressing an otherwise empty kitchen. I'll have kept him safe for James and Lily. Like I promised. Cecilia tried again to struggle, groaning at the effort,